In this video, I will explain how the trucker freedom protest was a massive prophetic sign from the righteous Christian God of the Bible. The trucker freedom protest was part of God's big picture of signs. To prove this, I am predicting that there will be a black swan event, a sudden unexpected crash in the stock market on February 25th, 2026. I am also predicting that Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom will be running mates in the 2028 election, and they will die together in a plane crash in St. Louis on August 2nd, 2028. This will clear the way for Michelle and Barack Obama to run for president and vice president in 2028. The Obamas are predicted to return to the White House on January 20th, 2029. I am also predicting that President Donald Trump will die on July 26th, 2028. How these predictions are known in advance will be explained in this video. The date that this video is posted to the social media platform that you are watching it on proves that these predictions are being made ahead of time, as do these time-stamped emails and forensic notes PDF documents. If you are skeptical for some reason, please email me and I will forward these to you. It is predicted that there will be a crash in the stock market on February 25th, 2026. As we can see, this email was composed on February 23rd, prior to the prediction for February 25th. If you are skeptical for some reason, please email me and I will forward this to you. In the account of Noah's flood in the book of Genesis in the Bible, the flood judgment from God began on the 17th day of the second month, which is February 17th in the Gregorian calendar. A few weeks prior to February 17th, 2018, I predicted that the Weather Channel would officially name Winter Storm Noah on February 17th, 2018, because they put out a list of the names of the storms they will have for the season in advance of the season, and it was observed that there included a storm that would be named Noah, and therefore it was concluded that, well, obviously this storm Noah would be named on February 17th because of Noah's flood. And sure enough, this is exactly what happened as predicted. In Noah's Ark, 8 people were rescued. The number 2018 ends with the number 8. Exactly 8 years after Winter Storm Noah was named on February 17th, 2018, was a winter storm that shut down the I-80 at Donner Pass on February 17th, 2026. Make sure you watch the Donner Pass video for much more details than what is being explained here, including the prophetic significance of Donner Pass. 8 years is 4 plus 4 years. On February 17th, 2026, next to Donner Pass was the 4th deadliest avalanche in U.S. history that involved 4 guides in a skiing expedition. February 17th, 2026 was exactly 4 years after the climax of the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest in Ottawa that involved the tabling of the Emergencies Act in the 44th Canadian Parliament on February 17th, 2022. On February 17th, 2026, 8 people were reported dead that were in the skiing expedition next to Donner Pass, where the I-80 was shut down. The collapse of snow from the height of the mountain peak on February 17th, 2026, in which 8 people died near the I-80, is 8 days before it is predicted there will be a collapse of the stock market from near its all-time peak high, as in mountain peak height, in valuation on February 25th, 2026. This is relevant because the date February 17th, the 17th day of the second month, not only hints at Noah's flood, but it hints at 9/11 in 2001, when two planes struck two towers 17 minutes apart. That's why it points to the flood judgment. It's all symbolism. The two towers were struck 17 minutes apart to point to the flood judgment. In the Bible, the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment. The two towers collapsed near Wall Street, where it is predicted that 8 days after 8 deaths, in the collapse of the snow on February 17th, the 17th day of the second month, 8 days after the 8 deaths on the 17th day of the second month in the winter storm, as in Noah's flood storm, 8 days after the 8 deaths near the I-80 and other things that happened on that day that I won't get into in this video, that involved the number 8, there will be a collapse, as in the collapse of snow from a height in the stock market on Wall Street, which is where the two towers were struck 17 minutes apart. As can be seen in this email, the prediction that Kamala Harris will die in a plane crash has been known since at least August 5th, 2021. The Trucker Freedom Convoy was a long line of trucks that traversed the continent parallel with the US-Canada border wall of security, which is the 49th parallel longitudinal line, and 49 is 7 times 7. In the book of Joshua in the Bible, the border wall of security of the ancient city of Jericho collapsed in God's judgment after the Israelites enacted a symbolic 3 sets of 7 and then blew trumpets. They marched around the walls of security once per day for 7 days, and then on the 7th day, they marched around 7 times while blowing 7 trumpets. The Trucker Freedom Convoy along the border wall of security, that is the 7 times 7th parallel line, their protests at the border crossings, and their blowing of their trucks' horns is symbolic of the collapse of the border wall of security of Jericho after a symbolic 3 sets of 7 that included blowing trumpets. On the day that the Emergencies Act was tabled in Parliament, Christians marched around the perimeter of Parliament for a 7th day in a row, and then blew an ancient Hebrew shofar horn trumpet. This march included crossing the border between the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. The Christians that enacted this march did not know 7 days ahead of time that the climactic day of their march would coincide with the tabling of the Emergencies Act. This march by Christians that mirrored the march of the Israelites in the book of Joshua was a prophetic sign from God that trumpeted for God judgment on the Liberals and leftists of Canada, and was communicating judgment and destruction for Canada and its border wall of security collapsing in God's judgment. The climax of the Trucker Freedom Protest prophetic sign was the tabling of the Emergencies Act in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa on February 17, 2022. The Emergencies Act was about giving authority to the government to take away the bank accounts of the political dissidents involved in the protest. February 17th, the date 217, is the date on which the flood judgment began in the Bible, and on 9/11 in 2001, it was 2 planes that struck 2 towers 17 minutes apart. From the Bible, the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment. On 9/11, Trump called into Channel 9 News and inadvertently trumpeted that his tower on Wall Street had become the tallest tower in Lower Manhattan after the 110 stories collapsed in God's judgment. In the Bible, Joshua, who died at the age of 110, led the Israelites around the walls of security of Jericho before they collapsed in God's judgment. Wall Street was named after the 9-foot-high wall of security that the Dutch built to keep the British and the Indians out. The number 145 is the 49th semi-prime number. This is why exactly 145 weeks after the climax of the trucker freedom protest that began along the 49th parallel border wall of security, the climax of which involved the restriction of bank accounts, was the day that the 9/11 mayor announced to the world that he no longer has a bank account or credit card because of the lawfare persecution he is receiving from the blue team for his politics and support of Trump. The 9/11 mayor stated to the media that he no longer had a bank account on November 27, 2024, exactly 191 weeks, which hints at 9/11, before Trump is predicted to die on July 26, 2028. The Apostle Paul used the phrase "the last trump" in association with the rapture, an event in Bible prophecy in which God's faithful will be rescued from the persecution from the Antichrist. The word rapture in Strong's Greek Bible Concordance is G726, which is why Trump is predicted to die on the date 7/26, July 26th. His death will be the last Trump prophetic sign. In Bible prophecy, the number 144 is associated with the rapture. The 9/11 mayor stated that he no longer has a bank account exactly 144 weeks after the Emergencies Act was revoked on February 23, 2022. The revoking of the Emergencies Act is symbolic of the end of persecution for God's faithful with their rescue in the rapture, hence the 144 weeks connection, which in turn connects to the date 7/26 and the last Trump sign. Kamala Harris is the 49th U.S. Vice President. 49 is 7 times 7. She is known for championing abortion rights, and the day that the trucker freedom protest began on January 22, 2022, along the 7 times 7th latitudinal line border wall of security, was exactly 7 times 7 years after 7 U.S. Supreme Court justices voted to legalize abortions. This was a symbolic 3 sets of 7 that implies God's judgment and the ongoing collapse of Canada's and America's metaphorical border wall of security due to its abortions. This is why many unborn babies died in the wombs of the women who took the things that the truckers were protesting. It was judgment on these women for condoning the murder of other people's unborn babies. Harris's plane crash is predicted to be in St. Louis, near the area of the country nicknamed Little Egypt. On the same day the Emergencies Act was tabled in the Canadian Parliament, was the official release of the trailer for the new Elvis movie. Elvis took the polio thing in front of the press before performing on the Ed Sullivan Show on October 28, 1956. This changed the course of history and the thing industry, as it greatly influenced baby boomers' perception of taking things. The number 9 symbolizes God's judgment. In the Bible, judgment on a people symbolically begins at the gate. Elvis took the thing on October 28, 1956, exactly 9 years before construction was completed on the Gateway Arch, the gateway to the west in St. Louis. Elvis's 9th soundtrack album was Roustabout, and one of the tracks is Little Egypt. St. Louis is near Little Egypt. Elvis's Graceland mansion is in Memphis, Tennessee, in Little Egypt. Memphis, Tennessee is named after Memphis, Egypt. The King of Rock's mansion is symbolic of the King of Egypt's palace. The King of Egypt in the Bible is symbolic of Satan and is a type for the Antichrist. The Antichrist will become the Antichrist through the replacement of Kamala Harris after her predicted death in a plane crash next to the Gateway Arch near Little Egypt. Harris was born 1 year, 8 months, and 8 days after construction began on the Gateway Arch. 1 year, 8 months, and 8 days hints at the number 188, a number God uses frequently to point to H188 in Strong's Hebrew Concordance, which is the word that means woe, exclamation mark, and is used in the Bible in the context of extreme judgment from God. Harris's birthday on October 20th, 1964, was the same day as the release of Elvis's Roustabout album with its song Little Egypt. The date of Harris's birth and the release of Elvis's album with its song Little Egypt was exactly 3,140 weeks before Pope Francis began a ritual of knocking on a cathedral door. 3,140 weeks hints at the number 314. Kamala Harris is predicted to die in a plane crash in St. Louis in the area code 314, which is near Little Egypt. The Gateway Arch that is located in the area code 314 is symbolic of a portal door through which demons will pass through and possess people who have taken the mark of the Antichrist, which is the SHOT that the truckers protested. This 3,140 weeks is also 60 years and 66 days, which hints at the number 666, which is the number of the Antichrist in Bible prophecy. This is because God's prophetic signs reveal that Pope Francis is the Antichrist, who is predicted to be resurrected in April of 2029 by demons pretending to be aliens that will rise from the bottomless pit into the earthly realm through the portal door. 3,140 weeks hints at 314, which hints at the number for pi, 3.14. 22 divided by 7, the ratio 22/7, is the closest fraction to approximate pi. 22 divided by 7 hints at the number 227, which is the 49th prime number. The number 22,700 hints at 227 and the 49th prime number. Kamala Harris, the 49th vice president, traveled to Kalamazoo, Michigan, for a campaign rally with the predicted future 49th president, Michelle Obama, exactly 22,700 days after Elvis Presley spent the night in a motel in Kalama, Washington, while he was traveling to Seattle for the filming of the movie It Happened at the World's Fair. The Space Needle was built for the World's Fair in Seattle, and the Space Needle is symbolic of the thing Elvis took before performing on The Ed Sullivan Show, exactly 9 years before the completion of construction of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. Kamala Harris was born 1 year, 8 months, and 8 days after construction began on the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. H188 is the Hebrew word for woe! Used in the context of extreme judgment from God. And Harris is predicted to die in a plane crash in St. Louis next to the Gateway Arch, along with Gavin Newsom, the predicted Democrat nominee for president, exactly 188 weeks after Pope Francis knocked on the portal door. The deaths of Newsom and Harris, the 49th vice president, will clear the way for the Democrat Party to replace them in an emergency with Michelle Obama as the 49th president and Barack Obama as her vice president. This 188 weeks is also 1,318 days, and this is because the number of the Antichrist, 666, is mentioned in Revelation chapter 13:18 in context of a description of the mark of the Antichrist, which is the Space Needle SHOT that the truckers protested along the 49th parallel line. In the Bible, in the book of Joshua, before the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho collapsed in God's judgment, 7 Israelite priests blew 7 trumpets for a symbolic 7 times 7. And in terms of prophetic symbolism, Trump's election campaign and presidency were symbolized by his border wall of security. President Trump is God's trumpet that he uses to highlight and confirm his signs. The word trump in archaic English means trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet. Donald Trump was born on a Sabbath day, and the portion of Torah that was read in synagogues on the day that Trump was born was the passage from the book of Numbers, in which God commanded the making of trumpets. Trump was born exactly 23 months, which happens to be exactly 700 days, before Israel was reborn. And God used Trump in prophetic signs regarding the restoration of Israel. Donald Trump chose his running mate, Mike Pence, and their two names, Trump-Pence, hints at trumpets. Trump's presidency, including his election campaign, was synonymous with his border wall of security. Before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment on ancient Jericho, the Hebrews blew trumpets. Before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment on the ancient city of Jericho, the Hebrews marched around Jericho's walls of security 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. This was a 3 sets of 7. In the book of Revelation, which describes God's judgment in the end times period, there are also 3 sets of 7 judgments. When the Hebrews blew the trumpets at Jericho, it was an announcement from God of judgment on the city of Jericho. Likewise, President Trump's presidency was an announcement of judgment on the nation of America, God's Gentile nation and the only other nation in history besides Israel that was founded on a relationship with God. This is why President Trump's election campaign and presidency were synonymous with his border wall of security, and why on the first day of his presidency, on Inauguration Day, President Trump was exactly 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old, which was 3 sets of 7, and paralleled the 3 sets of 7 in the book of Joshua. Through the symbolic very beginning of Trump's presidency, God announced judgment on the nation. Joshua, the leader of the Hebrews, led them around the walls of security 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. On the day that President Trump was elected by 77 electoral votes, the leader of Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, had been in power for exactly 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. Trump was inaugurated in the year ending in 7, at the age of 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old, 73 days, which hints at 3 sets of 7, after he won the election by 77 electoral votes, on the same day that Netanyahu, as in Joshua, the leader of the Israelites, had been in office for 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. And Trump's election win by 77 electoral votes in 2016 was exactly 73 weeks after the beginning of his campaign, when he famously descended the golden escalator in Trump Tower. That day was exactly 188 months, as in whoa exclamation mark, after the 7.0 magnitude earthquake in Joshua Tree, California. In archaic English, the word Trump means a trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet. The Israelites marched around the walls of security for 7 days before the Israelites blew the trumpets and blew them for one long last trump before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment. Trump's death will be a symbolic last trump. The last trump is a phrase that the Apostle Paul used to refer to the rapture and rescue of Christ's faithful. On October 1st, 2024, Trump trumpeted that he was visiting sites that were devastated by Hurricane Helene. Hurricane Helene is compared with Hurricane Agnes in 1972 that also devastated mid-Atlantic states far inland from the coast. The main news story of Hurricane Helene was the devastation in Asheville in Buncombe County, North Carolina, where it was reported that 72 people were killed. This is why this hurricane is compared with Hurricane Agnes in 72, and why Trump will die 72 days after he visited the devastation. 72 is 66 plus 6, and the number of the Antichrist in Bible prophecy is 666. 72 is also 2 times 6 times 6, and Pope Francis, the Antichrist, was the 266th Pope. The name Agnes is a Greek name that means pure or holy. The word buncombe is a 19th century American political term meaning nonsense or unacceptable behavior. The first use of the word ash in the New Testament was when Jesus said, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." On the day that Hurricane Helene hit, a college football game in Asheville between Appalachian State and Liberty University was canceled without rescheduling. This is because God is removing his protection and Liberty is being canceled in America. 72 also hints at Genesis 7:11, the verse in the Bible in which the flood judgment began, and Hurricane Helene was known for the flooding it caused. 72 days after Trump visited disaster sites caused by flooding in Hurricane Helene, in which 72 people were killed in Asheville, was December 12th, 2024. On December 12th, Trump was at the stock exchange in Lower Manhattan to ring the ceremonial opening bell, and on this day, Time magazine named Trump the Person of the Year for the second time. As explained in the America is Out of Time video, and the America is Out of Time Back to the Future prophecy video, this pointed to the events in Lower Manhattan on 9/11, when 2 planes struck 2 towers that collapsed in God's judgment. Time magazine's announcement that Trump is the person of the year for the second time on the same day that Trump rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, near where the two planes struck the two towers, revealed adding 2 + 2 + 2 days to reach December 18th, the date of a second prophetic Trump sign on Wall Street. And through the events on 9/11, God pointed to George Washington, who was inaugurated on Wall Street and was born on the date 2/22. Trump is a type for Joshua in the Bible, who led the Israelites around the walls of security of Jericho before they collapsed in God's judgment. On December 18th, the Dow Jones stock average on Wall Street collapsed 1,123 points. 1,123 is the 188th prime number, and H188 in Strong's Concordance is the word that means woe! Used in the Bible in the context of extreme judgment from God. Joshua and the Israelites blew 7 trumpets before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment due to an earthquake, which archaeology proves, and exactly 188 months after the 7.0 earthquake in Joshua Tree, California, was the beginning of God's trumpet, when Trump descended the golden escalator in the Trump Tower, which was at the very beginning of Trump's 70th year. The only other time besides 9/11 when a foreign enemy attacked the nation's capital was exactly 188 years prior on 9/11 in 1813, when the British landed at George Washington's Mount Vernon estate and then proceeded to burn down the Capitol building and the White House, but not before the First Lady Dolly Madison famously rescued the portrait of George Washington. Trump is predicted to die exactly 188 weeks after Wall Street lost the 188th prime number of points. Trump's death will be the symbolic last trumpet blast before America's walls of security collapse in God's judgment. Trump's death will be the symbolic last prophetic Trump sign, and before the walls of security of Jericho collapsed in God's judgment, they blew trumpets for one long last trumpet blast. In archaic English, the word trump means trumpet, or the sounding of a trumpet. In the book of Joshua in the Bible, the Israelites blew trumpets before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment. The Israelites were led by Joshua, who died at the age of 110. Trump, God's trumpet, is predicted to die exactly 110 weeks after the release of the letter written by Mrs. Wall of the National Archives and Records Administration regarding 700 pages of supposedly classified documents that the FBI obtained from Trump after they breached his estate's walls of security. In turn, the day of Mrs. Wall's letter regarding 700 pages of classified documents was 188 days after the climax of the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest prophetic sign with the Emergencies Act in the Canadian Parliament, which, as I will explain, was a massive trumpet judgment of America's and Canada's walls of security collapsing in God's judgment, which is why the Trucker Freedom Protest was a convoy of trucks that blew their horns, their trumpets, along the border wall of security. The Trucker Freedom Protest was known for its noise disturbance in downtown Ottawa when they blew their horns, their trumpets, outside the perimeter wall of security of Parliament. The disturbance of their trumpets, their horns, was ultimately ended by a lawsuit by a 21-year-old woman. 21 is 3 sets of 7. The walls of security collapsed in God's judgment after the Israelites enacted a symbolic 3 sets of 7 when they marched around the walls once per day for 7 days, and then on the 7th day they marched around 7 times while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. The day that the Emergencies Act was tabled in Parliament was the 7th day of the Christians' march around the perimeter of security of Parliament, when they blew the shofar trumpet for God in judgment of the Liberal Party and those who supported them. God uses the number 188 for connections, as the 188th word in Strong's Hebrew Concordance is the word woe, ! Used in context of extreme judgment from God, including in the book of Revelation regarding prophecy for the end of the age. In Bible prophecy, the end times period of the Antichrist is symbolized by 7 years. Miss Wall's letter regarding 700 pages of documents was released exactly 7 years after ISIS blew up the ancient temple of the god Baal in Palmyra, Syria. This was in the summer of 2015, shortly after Trump first announced that he was running for president after his famous descent on the golden escalator in his Trump Tower. In other words, the Temple of Baal was destroyed at the symbolic beginning of Trump. In the Bible, after God anointed King Jehu through a prophet, Jehu descended the staircase from Ramoth Gilead. Jehu got the conservatives to join him and then raced erratically to the capital city in order to purge the land of the false prophets and the wicked elite. Today, the elitist leftist media constantly speaks of Trump's purge. Jehu slaughtered the false prophets of Baal in their temple. Jehu ruled as king for 28 years. Trump first entered national politics when he ran for president in the year 2000. Trump's reign as God's King Jehu is predicted to end 28 years later in 2028. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C. is said to be America's temple of democracy. In one of the corridors of the Capitol building is inscribed, "We have built no temple but the Capitol. We consult no common oracle but the Constitution." It was Joshua in the Bible who led the Israelites in a march around the walls of security of Jericho over 7 days before 7 trumpets were blown. And then the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment. It was Joshua, the leader, the president of the Israelites, that led them in their march around the walls of security of Jericho before they blew trumpets and the walls collapsed in God's judgment. Joshua died at the age of 110. Trump will die 110 weeks after Miss Wall's letter, which was exactly 110 days after lawyers filed for information on 80 actors that are suspected at America's temple on the 6th day of the first month in 2021. 80 actors that are suspected from the 6th day of the first month were in the news 110 days before Miss Wall's letter. In other words, through these signs and connections, God is saying that these 80 suspects that defense attorneys filed information on were instigators in perpetrating a setup conducted by the begins with an F followed by a B and ends with an I, deeply state, in order to get Trump and true conservatives and Christians. The purpose of this prediction in this video that is from God is to prove this. The 6th day of the first month was a setup. On the 6th day of the first month, it was announced that 80 Trumpers had been arrested at America's Temple, with the oldest being 80 years old. Also on the 6th day of the first month, inside America's Temple, it was 80 House representatives that objected to the shoplifted referendum results. This is because Trump is God's King Jehu from the book of 2 Kings in the Bible, and Jehu sent 80 men into the temple of Baal to destroy the temple and the prophets of Baal, which is why the beginning of Trump's campaign and presidency coincided with the destruction of the temple of Baal in Palmyra, Syria. Exactly 80 weeks before Miss Wall's letter was released was the first day of Trump's impeachment trial, which focused on his call at 1:10 p.m. to march to America's Temple. 1:10 p.m. hints at the number 110, the age at which Joshua died. The call to march at 1:10 p.m. and the subsequent breach of the security perimeter wall around America's Temple is an allusion to the trumpets that were blown after the Israelites marched around the walls of security of Jericho, led by Joshua, who died at the age of 110, hence why Trump's call to march was at 1:10 p.m. Archaeology proves that the walls of the ancient city of Jericho collapsed due to an earthquake, which is why Trump's impeachment trial over his call to march at 1:10 p.m. was exactly 50 years after America's most consequential earthquake in history, the San Fernando Valley earthquake on February 9th, 1971. It is said that had the earthquake lasted 3 more seconds, the wall at the dam in San Fernando would have collapsed and killed thousands of people. The date that this video is posted proves that this prediction is being made ahead of time. The number 9 symbolizes God's judgment, and God frequently repeats a number 3 times for emphasis of its symbolic meaning. The number 93 hints at 3 nines. The sun is 93 million miles away from Earth. 93 days after the climax of the trucker freedom protest prophetic sign, with the Emergencies Act in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, was the day that 900,000 people in Ottawa were without power due to a massive destructive windstorm weather event. As will be explained in this video, this weather event is pointing to the coming space weather event and solar flare from the sun that will knock out the power grid in North America. It will be a catastrophic emergency in Canada and America. The windstorm event in Ottawa was 93 days after the Emergencies Act prophetic sign in Ottawa. The sun is 93 million miles away from Earth, and on 9/11, it was Flight 93 that crashed with 44 people on board, which is why the Emergencies Act was tabled in the 44th Canadian Parliament, which points to the Antichrist in an emergency, the 44th president. The storm that knocked out the power in Ottawa was a rare type of storm called a derecho. U.S. media called the storm Canada's derecho storm. A derecho storm is a long and narrow wind storm. This storm began precisely at the Detroit-Windsor border crossing that the truckers had blocked during the protest, and the storm continued in a straight line all the way to Ottawa, where it did by far the most damage. In other words, the Long Narrow storm pointed to the Long Narrow trucker convoy across the country to Ottawa. The Trucker Freedom Protest was a convoy along the border wall of security to Canada's capital, and Canada's derecho storm began at Canada's busiest border wall of security crossing and then made a straight line to Canada's capital, where the Parliament is, where the Emergencies Act was enacted. A derecho storm is named after a type of punch in boxing. Punches in boxing are known as JABs. The truckers were protesting the JABs on the same day as the derecho wind weather event in the month of May was a prophetic boxing match involving the GOAT, greatest of all time, of boxing, Floyd Mayweather. His boxing shorts were white, red, green, and black, the same colors as the four horses of the apocalypse in Bible prophecy. He was wearing boxer shorts that were red, black, green, and white because the fight was in the UAE. These are the colors of the flag of the UAE, and the fight was rescheduled to May 1st, 2022, after the king of the UAE died. On the day of the weather event in May, on May 21st, 2022, Floyd Mayweather, the GOAT, came out of retirement to fight Dangerous Dawn, which hints at the ongoing fight between the GOAT Antichrist King, Obama, who will come out of retirement to become the president again, and God's King Jehu, Donald Trump, as in the boxer Dangerous Dawn. The green, black, red, and white horses of the apocalypse are described in the 7 seals of God's judgment in the book of Revelation. During the fight, Mayweather grabbed the round card from the woman and held it up. It was round number 7, and this hinted at the 7 seals and 7 trumpets of God's judgment. In the book of Genesis, the flood judgment was a weather event that lasted for 40 days. The ancient Israelites marched around the wall of security of Jericho before it collapsed in God's judgment, and they were led by Joshua, who died at the age of 110. 40 days is also 1 month and 10 days, which hints at the number 110, and 40 days after the Mayweather fight and the derecho windstorm that knocked out Ottawa's power grid was the day that Canadian soldier James Topp completed his Freedom March along the border wall of security between Canada and the US, across the continent from the West Coast, and marched into Ottawa. This was on June 30th, 2022, exactly 888 months after President Truman's National Freedom Day Act was approved by Congress. The number 888 is the numeric equivalent in Greek gematria of the name Jesus in Greek, the language of the New Testament. Jesus came and is coming to free the captives from captivity, which is what James Topp was protesting. His Freedom March climaxed with his arrival into Ottawa exactly 888 months, which symbolizes Jesus, after National Freedom Day. This will be a testament to how the source of true freedom is only in Lord Jesus Christ and his victory over the slave master of this world, Satan. The Freedom March by the Canadian war veteran climaxed in Ottawa exactly 40 days after the weather event in May in Ottawa that was the result of a storm named after a type of boxing punch, which was also the day of the prophetic Mayweather boxing match. Noah's flood in the Bible was a storm that lasted for 40 days. Exactly 40 days after the weather storm in Ottawa, on the same day as the Floyd Mayweather fight, was the day that James Topp arrived in Ottawa at the end of his Freedom March. In the account in the book of Genesis, the 40 days of Noah's flood began on the 17th day of the second month. The climax of the trucker freedom protest prophetic sign and the tabling of the Emergencies Act was on the 17th day of the second month in 2022. On the same day as the climax of the trucker freedom convoy protest and the Emergencies Act was the official release of the trailer for the new Elvis movie, in which Tom Hanks plays Colonel Parker, who stole Elvis from Sun Records, which is why the probe around the sun is named the Parker probe. The reason God has given me a voice through this prediction is to prove that everything that I am saying in this video is true. Proving all of the main conclusions in this video is the purpose for God giving this prediction in this video. In other words, this is a serious warning for those that disagree with the things being stated in this video. Although the Trucker Freedom Convoy is a broad protest against unconstitutional VACCINEMANDATES that violate international human rights law, including the NUREMBURG code regarding coercion to take an EXPERIMENTALINJECTION. The protest is mainly targeted at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his federal government. Justin Trudeau is the 23rd Prime Minister of Canada. He was elected exactly 7 years after the 44th President of America was elected, which is more of a coincidence than it might seem. Canadian elections are not always held in November as they are in the US. In Bible prophecy, 7 years symbolizes the period of the Antichrist's rule. God pairs the numbers 23 and 44 together in his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, to point to the 44th president, the basketball president, who wore jersey number 23 in high school. In fact, the date the 44th president and the 23rd prime minister were elected, November 4th, hints at 11 times 4 equals 44. Thus, the election of the 23rd prime minister on 11/4 is in itself a pairing of 23 and 44. The 23rd prime minister was also elected at the age of 44. And as will be explained in this video, the extremely important and major prophetic sign of this Trucker Freedom Convoy protest, the prophetic sign that was the Emergencies Act, was enacted in the 44th Parliament. It was the 44th Parliament in Canadian history, and the Emergencies Act was enacted in the 44th Parliament by the 23rd Prime Minister, which is an extremely prophetic pairing of the numbers 23 and 44. God used President Richard Nixon in a few prophetic ways. He saved Israel in its darkest hour during the Yom Kippur War, when even his Jewish advisor, Henry Kissinger, advised him not to. He did this because at the critical moment of decision, he remembered his mother reading him the Bible as a kid. It is said that later on, Nixon cried when he realized how God had used him for that moment in history. Had Nixon not helped, there would not be the nation of Israel today. Nixon also delivered a prophecy. The media calls it the Nixon prophecy. At a state dinner in Ottawa, Nixon gave a toast. He toasted that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau's 4-month-old son would one day become the Prime Minister of Canada. 44 years to the exact month after Nixon said that 4-month-old Justin Trudeau would one day become the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau was being toasted by the 44th president at the White House at a state dinner. Justin Trudeau and Barack Obama were involved in another prophetic sign that also involved a friendly dinner. In Bible prophecy, it is said that the Antichrist will rule the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during the end times period. In the book of the prophet Daniel, a prophecy that regards the Antichrist's period of rule on the Temple Mount includes a period of 49 years. The name Montreal in French means Mount Royal. God uses this city to symbolize the Antichrist on the Temple Mount, including the prophetic sign when Justin Trudeau excitedly met Obama for dinner in Montreal after telling him and social media it was his home city. Their dinner together was exactly 49 years after Jews captured the Temple Mount during the Six-Day War on June 7, 1967, thus controlling their ancient capital Jerusalem and the Temple Mount for the first time in 20 centuries. The Trucker Freedom Convoy is not only known for its protests in Ottawa and face-off with the 23rd Prime Minister, it is also known for its border-crossing blockades. Only two nations in the history of the world were founded not on ethnicity or language or politics, but on a relationship with God: Israel and America. The Pilgrims founded what would later become America and Canada. The Pilgrims crossed the Atlantic Ocean in an escape from religious and political persecution. They saw their crossing as a parallel with the Bible and the Hebrews' crossing of the Jordan River into the Promised Land. The Hebrews were also escaping persecution in Egypt. In the Bible, the collapse of walls of security symbolize God's judgment on a nation. Judgment destruction from God came upon ancient Israel after it had known God but then turned and rebelled against God. America and Canada are in the process of being destroyed by God because, like Israel, these nations were blessed by God, but have now turned from and are rebelling against God. Before the walls of security of ancient Jericho collapsed in God's judgment, the Hebrews marched around the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho in a form of protest while they blew trumpets. God used President Trump and his presidency for this Jericho symbolism. President Trump is God's trumpet that he uses to highlight and confirm his signs. The word trump in archaic English means trumpet or the sounding of a trumpet. Donald Trump was born on a Sabbath day, and the portion of Torah that was read in synagogues on the day that Trump was born was the passage from the book of Numbers, in which God commanded the making of trumpets. Trump was born exactly 23 months, which happens to be exactly 700 days, before Israel was reborn. And God used Trump in prophetic signs regarding the restoration of Israel. Donald Trump chose his running mate, Mike Pence, and their two names, Trump-Pence, hints at trumpets. Trump's presidency, including his election campaign, was synonymous with his border wall of security. Before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment on ancient Jericho, the Hebrews blew trumpets. Before the walls of security collapsed in God's judgment on the ancient city of Jericho, the Hebrews marched around Jericho's walls of security 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. This was a 3 sets of 7. In the book of Revelation, which describes God's judgment in the end times period, there are also 3 sets of 7 judgments. When the Hebrews blew the trumpets at Jericho, it was an announcement from God of judgment on the city of Jericho. Likewise, President Trump's presidency was an announcement of judgment on the nation of America, God's Gentile nation and the only other nation in history besides Israel that was founded on a relationship with God. This is why President Trump's election campaign and presidency were synonymous with his border wall of security, and why on the first day of his presidency, on Inauguration Day, President Trump was exactly 70 years, 7 months, and 7 days old, which was 3 sets of 7 and paralleled the 3 sets of 7 in the book of Joshua. Through the symbolic very beginning of Trump's presidency, God announced judgment on the nation. Joshua, the leader of the Hebrews, led them around the walls of security 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. On the day that President Trump was elected by 77 electoral votes, the leader of Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, had been in power for exactly 7 years, 7 months, and 7 days. It is no coincidence that Trump's election campaign and presidency were synonymous with his border wall of security. God has used many prophetic judgment warning signs involving the U.S. southern border. This major prophetic sign, however, involves America's northern border with Canada. The trucker protests at the border, when truckers blockaded a few of the major border crossings, and this crisis that threatened economic consequences, is symbolism that God is using to point to the Bible and the impending collapse of America's and Canada's walls of security in judgment from God. Canada's seat of government, Parliament Hill, symbolizes ancient Jericho. In the story of Jericho in the book of Joshua in the Bible, the Hebrews marched around the walls of Jericho once every day for 7 days. On the 7th day, they marched around the walls of security of Jericho 7 times while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. And then the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho collapsed in judgment from God. The Hebrews on the 7th day marched around Jericho 7 times while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets, and then the walls of security collapsed. Beginning on Friday, February 11th, in a deliberate parallel with the story of Jericho in the Bible, Christian freedom protesters marched in a complete circle around the Parliament buildings on Parliament Hill. This began the symbolic 7 days of marching around the walls of Jericho. February 17th was the 7th day of this protest march. In the story of Jericho in the Bible, on the 7th day of marches, the Hebrews marched around Jericho 7 times, and 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. And then the walls of security collapsed in judgment from God. On this 7th day of protest marches around the Canadian Parliament, the Christian freedom protesters marched around Parliament 7 times and then blew the shofar, which is the type of horn trumpet that was used in ancient Israel. This 7th day of protest marches around Parliament happened to be, coincidentally, the very day that the 23rd Prime Minister in the 44th Parliament initiated debate on the Emergencies Act, which was symbolism for the coming emergency, the end times period, which includes persecution from the Antichrist, the 44th President, and his partner in crime, the 23rd Prime Minister. The Emergencies Act allows the federal government to discard the Constitution and restrict free speech and other rights such as the ability to transact in the economy and have a bank account. The truth is, this Emergencies Act was meant to persecute and punish what the liberals call, quote, Trumpers, end quote. At the same time that the Emergencies Act was being introduced in Parliament and Trumpers were blowing the shofar, outside of Parliament, Trumpers were blowing their horns in their trucks. One of the bigger aspects of this whole story was the Trumper truckers' horns. An example is the news story regarding how this disturbed the local residents. When the Hebrews blew their trumpets as they marched around Jericho prior to its destruction, the local residents in Jericho would have been disturbed. which was the very purpose of the symbolism behind the truckers' horns. They symbolized the trumpets that were blown around the walls of security of ancient Jericho before they collapsed in God's judgment. Another example of this Jericho symbolism in this story was the story of the 21-year-old girl that the media touted as being responsible for stopping the horns. And of course, a main emphasis of this story was the girl's young age of 21 years. This 21-year-old girl was the lead plaintiff in the class action lawsuit for which a judge ruled a 10-day injunction on the horn blowing. God uses the number 21 as symbolism for 3 sets of 7. 21 is 3 times 7. The Hebrews marched around the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho 7 times while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets, which is 3 sets of 7. In the book of Revelation in the Bible, prophecy describes 3 sets of 7 judgments from God in the end times period. This 3 sets of 7 judgments in the book of Revelation includes 7 trumpet judgments. When the truckers were blowing their horns as they made their way from Western Canada to Ottawa, as they traversed across the nation a long route that paralleled and was just north of the border wall of security. This symbolized when the Hebrews marched around the walls of security of ancient Jericho while they were blowing trumpets. When the truckers were blowing their horns outside the perimeter of Parliament, this symbolized the Hebrews blowing their trumpets outside the walls of ancient Jericho. The walls of security are going to collapse in God's judgment, and God used these Christian trumpers to symbolize this. The truth is, we are presently at the climax of a civil war that has been escalating for decades. For example, this woman, the organizer of the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest, is the first symbolic prisoner of war in this civil war. The beginning of the crackdown of political dissidents of the totalitarian left. Unlike the American Civil War that began in 1861, those two sides shared common values. They disagreed on slavery. Today, the two opposing cultures within America agree on absolutely nothing that is important. This civil war is actually a civil war between two worldviews that are incompatible with each other. This war is between the worldview of secular progressive liberalism and a worldview rooted in Judeo-Christian values. And the progressive liberal left is not at all interested in coexisting peacefully with their enemy. The truth is, whether those on the left are fully conscious of it or not, in this climax to the Civil War, COVID and MASKs and the VACCINE is being used as a political weapon by those in the political cult of the progressive liberal left. The progressive liberal left controls 90% of the media in America and even more than 90% in Canada. And they no longer have any integrity at all, and their movement has become a totalitarian cult. They are fighting a civil war, and if it requires lying and manipulation and misinformation, they will do it. Which is why the mainstream media constantly lies and manipulates. Although they control most of the media, it does not satisfy them because it is not fully effective enough. And now they are blatantly continuing their process of silencing the voices of their enemy, true conservatives and Christians. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said, their views are, quote, unacceptable, end quote. He went on to say that they are just taking up space. He said that Canadians have to make a choice as to whether or not they tolerate these people. Trudeau said that those that disagree with COVID and VACCINE MANDATES are racists and misogynists. In the political cult of the left, these words and accusations are used with the intention of implying the equivalent of excommunication from a religious congregation. With these words, Trudeau, along with his followers in the progressive liberal political cult of the left, are communicating the desire to expel true conservatives and true Christians from society. The leader of France, Emmanuel Macron, echoed this sentiment when he said that those that don't take the VACCINE are lesser citizens. In Canada, journalists now need a license from the Liberal government in order to operate alongside the other news outlets that are all completely funded or heavily subsidized by the Liberal federal government. Anything that conflicts with their ideological narrative is labeled disinformation and conspiracy theory, which is also another weapon in their arsenal. A classic tactic in Marxist communism is to accuse the enemy of doing the very thing that they are doing. And the irony is the supposed fact checkers and supposed truth gatekeepers of the political left accuse their enemy of the very thing that they do, which is misinformation and bias and lying. This is why, if you consume mainstream media, you absolutely did not know any truth regarding what was happening with the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest, and instead believed many lies regarding this protest. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you consume mainstream media today, you pretty much are deceived regarding almost everything today. Today in Canada, if you have not taken the VACCINE, you cannot travel within Canada, and you are not allowed to leave the country. But this is just the beginning of the evil totalitarianism that is coming. It is ultimately leading to genocide, which incidentally is one of the symbolic reasons for masks. Before I explain this, it needs to be explained that totalitarian regimes differ from classic dictatorships. In dictatorships, people comply out of fear. In totalitarianism, 30% of the population are true believers, 40% are spineless, unthinking followers that comply for convenience sake, and the remaining 30% try to resist the ever-increasing evil authoritarianism perpetrated by the 30% that are in the hypnotized mob. And unless the weaker, spineless 40% wake up and join the resistors, the evil will increase until it climaxes with extreme atrocities and burns itself out. The now famous clinical psychology professor from Ghent University in Belgium, Matthias Desmat, explains that Western countries are going through what is called a mass FORMATION, or mass PSYCHOSIS. Like Nazi Germany and Communist Russia in the 1930s, the insanity will continue to escalate, and once they are done destroying their enemy, they will turn on themselves, which is when it will theoretically burn out. This is what happened in Stalinist Russia. After the people finally woke up in Mussolini, Italy, they came after and killed the leaders of their cult. The Antichrists, Barack Obama and Pope Francis, will assume leadership of this current mass FORMATION, which will then last until when Lord Jesus Christ will defeat the Antichrist at his second coming. This current mass FORMATION did not begin with COVID. As was stated, we are in the climax of a civil war between worldviews that has spiritual roots. The mass FORMATION really got going with the election of President Trump, which is what really began the psychological unhinging of the progressive liberal left. This climax to the Civil War and this mass FORMATION began with Trump derangement syndrome and the obsession with the left with taking down Trump. Trump and his personality were designed by God for this specific purpose of stirring up this hornet's nest and revealing the true colors of the secular progressive liberal left, which is totalitarian. MASKs are a classic textbook form of clothing modification that cults use to signal to others that they are a member of the cult and the tribe. But cults also use forms of clothing modification to indoctrinate and eliminate critical thinking among their adherents. MASKs are a textbook example of this, as for example, the VIRUS is 0.5 microns in size, and MASKs do not filter anything below 3 microns. Not only is MASK squaring unhealthy in general, but breathing in the microplastics in MASKs exacerbates the VIRUS. Doctors wear MASKs as splash guards and have never worn MASKs in hospitals for the purpose of protection against VIRUSs. This is why prior to COVID, all published scientific studies demonstrated the inefficacy of MASKs regarding VIRUSs. And all of the Western nations' protocols for a possible pandemic included recommending not wearing MASKs. Even Anthony Fauci, before MASKs became a political weapon, was caught in his emails saying that MASKs don't work. And in the beginning, Anthony Fauci was on 60 Minutes saying this very thing, that masks don't work, and they in fact increase the probability of getting infected and are unhealthy. You can find him saying these things and more on YouTube. Just type into YouTube 60 Minutes Anthony Fauci and masks, and you will find this clip. Throughout the pandemic, kids in Sweden never wore MASKs to school, and not one child became seriously ill or died. The Swedes also had no LOCKDOWNs or school LOCKDOWNs, which is another political weapon that the cult of the left uses, and no child died from COVID. Cults and religions use rituals to indoctrinate and signal membership. The more impractical and absurd something is, the better it serves as a ritual. MASKs for the VIRUS are absurd and are a textbook form of ritual in the cult of COVID and the secular progressive liberal political cult. Not only are MASKs used as an exercise and demonstration of obedience to the totalitarian political cult of the left, MASKs also symbolize anonymity. And when people are anonymous in crowds, in mobs, they will commit crimes that they would not do on their own as an individual. This is why members of Antifa wear MASKs when, as a large mob of people, they collectively smash things and commit acts of violence. This phenomenon was also illustrated well in the story of The Lord of the Flies, a story about kids stranded on a remote tropical island with no adult supervision. It was intended by the author to be a metaphor for the ultimate outcome of civilization once it had discarded the authority of a transcendent God. The kids would apply paint to their faces before assembling together in the hunter's cult. It was the application of the face paint that signified the transformation of their persona into a tribalistic barbarian. In the story, their cult and cult leader ultimately led them to commit murder and atrocities against the other kids. The protagonist of the story tells two of the weaker follower kids that because they are part of the hunter's cult, they are equally as guilty of murder. The followers that are going along with the MASKs and the VACCINE requirements are already guilty of mass murder and will be equally guilty of the upcoming genocide. The COVID MASKs are the equivalent of the face paint in The Lord of the Flies. Soon, the Antichrist will lead the hypnotized and critically unthinking members of this MASKs wearing cult to commit genocide against their enemy, conservatives and Christians. This is how, for example, the citizens of the nation of Germany in the 1930s were collectively capable of murdering millions of people. Today, we are in the early stages of the very same genocide that happened in Germany. Like the Nazi and Marxist communist political cults of the 1930s, fear and resentment is used to brainwash the followers of the secular progressive liberalism political cult and cult of COVID. Likewise, in the story Lord of the Flies, fear of the unseen, invisible monster in the forest was used to recruit the kids into the hunter's cult, and resentment against the good guys and the others that weren't in the hunter's club was also used to strengthen the bonds of those in the hunter's cult. Those in the hunter's cult convinced themselves that they were superior in every way through things like hunting, for example, compared to the good guys that weren't in the hunter's cult. Likewise, those in the secular progressive liberal cult of the left believe that they are morally and intellectually superior to true conservatives and true Christians. Those in the secular progressive liberal cult of the left demonstrate to each other their superiority over true conservatives and true Christians through virtue signaling with things like MASKs and VACCINE shots, the more the better, for example, through things like Ukrainian flags and kneeling in Black Lives Matter protests, which was symbolism for kneeling to Satan, which is why the kneeling at the protests was for a symbolic 8 minutes and 46 seconds, which symbolized the time that Flight 11 hit the North Tower on 9/11 at 8:46 a.m. In fact, I believe this book, Lord of the Flies, is a gift and was designed by God, and manipulation through the fear of the unseen and invisible monster in the forest, which was not a real threat, is a direct parallel of the manipulation through fear of the unseen, invisible COVID virus, which for the vast majority of people isn't even remotely the threat that the cult of COVID claims that it is, especially since God has designed a specific compound called ivermectin as his cure for COVID. The explanation for how God has proven through his true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections that ivermectin is literally the cure for COVID, which is explained in the absolute must-watch Tiger Woods prophecy video, which is one of the most important videos on this channel. The cult of COVID has suppressed the truth and lied about ivermectin. Besides ivermectin, even taking vitamin has been shown to reduce the risk of getting COVID by an amazing factor of 4. Yet, when have you ever heard of someone in the progressive liberal cult of COVID mention vitamin D? If the supposed health authorities in governments were sincerely interested in our health, they would begin with a campaign of encouraging vitamin D consumption. But instead, all you hear from the progressive liberals and these so-called leaders of government HEALTH agencies is how the VACCINE is the only way to combat COVID and is the savior of mankind. The truth is, these people running these HEALTH departments in government are either brainwashed true believers of the progressive liberal cult of COVID, or they know that they must comply with the cult in order to maintain their position. This consensus by coercion is exactly how the system functioned in 20th century socialist totalitarianism. And the truth is, these HEALTH agencies are also captive to the corrupt PHARMACUETICAL industry. The true plague is the plague of corruption. The corrupt PHRMACEUTICAL industry has made easy prey of society through fear and the progressive liberal political cult. In addition to using fear, the progressive liberal cult and the corrupt PHARMACEUTICAL industry have capitalized on resentment, when it comes to TREATMENTS for COVID. It was precisely because President Trump endorsed HYDROXYCHLOROQUINE in early 2020 that the left political cult have been against TREATMENTS for COVID and have swallowed the lies and disinformation from the corrupt PHARMACEUTICAL industry regarding TREATMENTS, such as HYDROXYCHLOROQUINE and IVERMECTIN, which, if used early after first SYMPTOMS, are 80 to 90% effective. In other words, many thousands of people died because of the suppression of TREATMENTS and IVERMECTIN, all of those that are in the progressive liberal cult and those that are going along for convenience sake are all collectively guilty of this mass MURDER, in the very same way that the majority of Germans in the 1930s were guilty of mass MURDER. You must ask God for forgiveness. It was the German philosophers and the German people that were the first in Western civilization to discard God. And in Nazi Germany, it began with progressive, incremental restrictions on the rights of Jews. It began with things like not being able to travel. It began with things like not being able to go to a particular restaurant or movie theater. This is the reason why the left desires to restrict the rights of people that disagree with them, such as their ideological cult of COVID and such as Trumpers. It is not at all a coincidence. It is designed by God that the first nation to make it illegal to be alive without having taken the EXPERIMENTAL VACCINE is Austria. This is a prophetic sign that points to Adolf Hitler, who is from Austria. After all, it was the Nazis that were guilty of forcing people against their will to take EXPERIMENTAL INJECTION. This is ultimately leading to genocide by the left of Christians and conservatives. It is a direct parallel of Nazi totalitarian Germany. This is the reason why God pointed to the Emergencies Act at the climax of this massive prophetic sign, which was the Canadian Trucker Freedom Convoy protest. Correctly understood, what is going on is not only a civil war between liberals and conservatives and Christians, those they call Trumpers, but it is a spiritual war, and one side is anti-God and is rebelling against God, and one side is unconsciously aligned with the powers of darkness and evil. And this is the largely unconscious spiritual truth behind why they hate Trumpers. The truth is they resent God. The truth is they are in rebellion against God, the God of the Bible, Lord Jesus Christ. The Trucker Freedom Convoy protest against the vaccine mandates began on the 49th anniversary of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in favor of legalizing abortion. 49 years is 7 times 7 years. The truckers, with their trumpeting horns, drove across Canada in a parallel line with the border wall of security, and it was a parallel with the book of Joshua. Joshua and the Hebrews marched around the walls of security of the ancient city of Jericho 7 times over 7 days, while 7 priests blew 7 trumpets. The Trumper protesters marched around Parliament in Ottawa, Canada 7 times over 7 days, and then blew the shofar horn. At the time the shofar horn was blown, debate began in the 44th Parliament over the Emergencies Act, which paralleled Hank Aaron, player number 44. The truckers began their symbolic drive to Parliament 7 times 7 years after abortion was made legal across America on January 22, 1973. This 7 times 7 years is Joshua, walls of security collapsing in judgment symbolism. As a result of the Trumpers and the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest, the Emergencies Act was passed, which is symbolism for the upcoming emergency after the walls of security collapse. Abortion was made legal for the baby boomer generation. Mass school shootings began with the Columbine High School shooting in 1999 and then progressed to university shootings in the 2000s. This directly coincided with the peak of baby boomers' kids in high school and then universities. God has allowed the murder of the baby boomers' kids, and mass school shootings have been judgment from God for this baby boomer generation condoning the murder of other people's babies. Likewise, the COVID virus was peculiar in that it only really affected the very old, barely affected the middle-aged people, and did not affect at all young kids. COVID was targeted by God at the baby boomer generation before this generation exits the stage of life. In response to this narcissistic generation did something unconscionable. Because of the mass formation, they broke the social contract and required young people to sacrifice for the old. Even though COVID doesn't affect young people, this older generation even made kids take the experimental gene therapy injections, which will turn out to be the biggest disaster in human history and the end of civilization in its current form. It is no coincidence that this massive prophetic sign that was the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest began exactly 7 times 7 years after abortion was made legal. New York State was the hardest hit by COVID, and it was the first state to legalize abortion. January 22, 2022 was the beginning of the drive of the truckers along the border wall of security, and this was also exactly 36 months after New York became the first state to pass a law that makes it legal to have an abortion right up until the day of birth. When this bill was passed, it was celebrated and cheered by the liberals in the New York State House Assembly. And also on this day, the One World Tower was lit up in the color of pink. 36 months is symbolism for the number 666, which is the number of the Antichrist. 36 is 6 times 6, and also 2 times 18, which is 6 plus 6 plus 6, and the 36th triangular number, which in a triangle of numbers, the last number in the 36th row is 666. And 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, all the way up to 36, equals 666. This is why the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest against the vaccines, which is a result of COVID, which is judgment warning from God for abortions, began exactly 36 months after this law was passed in New York State that made it legal for an abortion up until the date of birth. When the Israelites marched around the walls of Jericho, they did so in a symbolic 3 sets of 7, but it was once per day for 7 days. Then on the 7th day, they marched 7 times while blowing 7 trumpets. It was in fact a 7 followed by a 7 times 7. The day that the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest began, its convoy across Canada, was 7 times 7 years after 7 justices voted in favor of legalizing abortions. 7 Supreme Court justices voted in favor of legalizing abortions, And then 7 times 7 years later, the trucker convoy freedom protest began its move across the nation on the other side of the border wall of security of America, which is the 49th parallel. The 49th latitudinal line is the border between America and Canada that the trucker freedom convoy protest began traveling parallel to while blowing their horns, which were symbolism for trumpets. And 49 is 7 times 7. And so from the day that 7 justices voted in favor of legalizing abortions, it is 7 times 7 years exactly to the day that the convoy began its long drive parallel to the 49th parallel, the 49th longitudinal line, which hints at 7 times 7. This is massive judgment, warning for America, for abortions. God used Hank Aaron and his death to identify what is called in Bible prophecy the mark of the Antichrist, which, as Bible prophecy says, if one takes this mark, they will be going to the place of consuming fire and die the second death after they have been resurrected. But if one does not take this mark, as it says, they will be persecuted and will not be able to, quote, buy or sell, unquote, and participate in society, which is the purpose of the VACCINE passports. That the majority of Christians have not been able to recognize that this VACCINE is the mark of the Antichrist and is not a supposed precursor to the mark of the Antichrist is the subject of other videos. But it is judgment from God on these Christians for having lost their saltiness and for their Nicolaitan doctrine of dispensationalism and free grace and once saved, always saved doctrine, and the works that are a product of this doctrine that Jesus said he hates and is coming to make war on with the sword of his mouth. That said, I personally believe that it is possible to repent after taking the VACCINE mark of the Antichrist. But this VACCINE, continually taking it, is part of a process that is leading to demonic possession. In Bible prophecy, the number 666 is associated with the Antichrist that is mentioned in the last and 66th book of the Bible. Hank Aaron, player 44, died 6 + 6 + 6 days after he took the VACCINE. He died 66 days before the Suez Canal ship became unstuck after clogging the world's trade artery, which symbolized the clogged arteries that are a result of this VACCINE. The truckers' freedom protest blockade at the busiest trade artery between Canada and the US, the Ambassador Bridge, also symbolized the clogged arteries from the VACCINE. This protest is in protest of this VACCINE mandate. And the other blockades at the other trade arteries between Canada and the US also symbolize this. And also the clogged streets of Ottawa with the trucks at the protest in Ottawa also symbolize the clogged arteries from the VACCINE. The Suez Canal became unclogged 6 + 6 + 6 days after acting President Joe Biden delivered his first public address since having stolen the White House. It was his big VACCINE speech. Player 44 died 44 weeks and 4 days before famous televangelist Marcus Lamb died, a preacher famous for vehemently warning Christians not to take the VACCINE. His name, Marcus, hints at mark of the Antichrist. On the day that Marcus Lamb died, the S&P 500 stock market index closed at precisely 4,567.00 points. The 500th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word Antichrist, and the 4,567th word is the word Satan. The number 9 is the most important number in God's true big picture of end times judgment warning signs. From the Bible, the number 9 symbolizes judgment. When asked by his disciples for the signs to look for of his return, Jesus replied with the metaphor of birth pains. 9 months is the average human gestation period. 9 months symbolizes the birth pains of the end times. Hank Aaron died exactly 9 months before Alec Baldwin's shot on the movie set that killed the photographer, which symbolizes the VACCINE shots that kill. This occurred in the 47th state, and the Antichrist, Barack Obama, will replace the 47th president, Michelle Obama. Hank Aaron played his career with the Atlanta Braves. Aaron died 9 months and 11 days before the Atlanta Braves won the 117th World Series, which began exactly 666 weeks after the 44th presidency began, after the inauguration of Barack Obama, and that was exactly 117 months after the Columbine shooting massacre. This 9 months and 11 days connection hints at the 9/11 judgment warning, and the 117th World Series hints at the 117th Congress. This 117th World Series commemorated Hank Aaron, who took the VACCINE on the first day of the 117th Congress. The Canadian Trucker Freedom Convoy that is protesting the MANDATE for the deadly VACCINE began in Western Canada on the 1-year anniversary of Hank Aaron's death from the VACCINE. 1 year is 4 + 4 + 4 months exactly, and Hank Aaron was player number 44, the home run king, because the Antichrist king is the 44th president. It cannot be stated how important this is. It is extremely important that the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest began on the anniversary that Hank Aaron died from the experimental injection. The reason this is so important is because it is directly related to the root reason for COVID and the vaccines, which is the mark of the beast, the mark of the Antichrist. The root reason is judgment from God for abortions. The shots that people receive in a mass shooting is symbolism for the deadly shots that people received for COVID, which are the mark of the Antichrist. The home run king, player number 44, died after taking the injection exactly 444 weeks after the deadly mass shooting in the movie theater in Denver, Colorado, during the Batman movie Dark Knight Rises, which was in turn exactly 42 months after the rise of the Antichrist and the inauguration of the 44th president. In Bible prophecy, the Antichrist's period is symbolized by 42 months. The inauguration of the 44th president was in turn exactly 117 months after the Columbine shooting in Denver, Colorado. And Hank Aaron, number 44, died from the injection 6 + 6 + 6 days after taking the injection on the first day of the 117th Congress. Kamala Harris's plane is predicted to crash in St. Louis, where the eclipse over America peaked at 1:17 p.m., which hints at 117. The phrase, "let it divide" in Hebrew in Genesis chapter 1 is equivalent to 117 in Hebrew gematria. The middle dividing chapter of the Bible is Psalms 117. It is through the injection that Aaron took on the first day of the 117th Congress that God is spiritually dividing people. God is in the process of separating, dividing the sheep from the goats, and a main way in which this is achieved is through the mark of the Antichrist, which is the mRNA COVID injection. 42 months in Bible prophecy is equivalent to 1,260 days. Obama's inauguration in 2009 was 42 months before the Dark Knight Rises movie massacre, and his rise to the president's office and his inauguration was exactly 1,260 years after the deadliest earthquake in Israel's history that killed thousands of people. The Columbine shooting was perpetrated by a boy named Harris and another boy named Dylan Klebold. The name Harris hints at Kamala Devi Harris, and the initials Dylan Klebold hint at the initials KD in Kamala Devi Harris. The Columbine shooting was exactly 12,600 days after the birth of Kamala Harris, which hints at the 1,260 days in Bible prophecy that symbolizes the period of the Antichrist. The number 666 is symbolism for the Antichrist, and 12,600 days is also exactly 600 plus 600 plus 600 weeks, which hints at 666. The role of the Antichrist in the end times is to enforce the mark of the Antichrist, which is the injection, the experimental mRNA injection that changes DNA, inserts snake venom as the spike protein into one's DNA, and uses aborted fetal stem cells in its development. This is a spiritual abomination, and it will be enforced through the Antichrist. The Antichrist will enforce the taking of the mark of the Antichrist through rationed food. This rationed food in a national emergency will be restricted only to those who have taken the mark of the Antichrist through digital programmable currency. This is why this story about the Emergencies Act was about how it was used to restrict the people that supported the truckers and the truckers themselves from being able to use bank accounts. It was all about money and digital currency. It was symbolism for the coming use of digital programmable currency that will be used to restrict those who have not taken the mark of the Antichrist from being able to buy and sell food. This story is also hinted at through the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, the first black regiment in the Civil War. The Civil War, about slavery and freedom, is the theme of the Bible and is the theme of life. And it is this theme of slavery and freedom that is being played out through the Antichrist and the mark of the Antichrist and the mass hypnosis totalitarian movement of the political left. The story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment is that they were not fairly paid. Oppressive minority laws were used to not pay them the same pay that the other white Northern soldiers were paid, which was $13 per month, which hinted at the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. This theme in God's signs, this symbolism of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and this money, currency that they weren't paid, and oppressive minority laws, and this theme of slavery and freedom is why James Topp's Freedom March into Ottawa was exactly 888 months after the passage of the National Freedom Day Act, which commemorated the passage of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. The majority of people that call themselves Christians will be left behind. Those Christians that will be left behind and Christians that will come to faith during the end times will undergo what Jesus described in the book of Revelation as being a symbolic 10 days of testing of their faith. This testing of their faith will come through persecution from the Antichrist and the mark of the Antichrist, which is the VACCINE. Taking the VACCINE mark of the Antichrist is tantamount to denying Jesus. The mRNA experimental gene therapy injection that changes one's DNA and uses aborted fetal stem cells in its development is a spiritual abomination. It is the mark of the Antichrist. It is not a supposed precursor to the mark of the Antichrist. The reason why God has given me a voice through this prediction is to prove this. To not appreciate this is to miss the point of this prediction and these predictions and the point of this video and the point of this video channel. The mark of the Antichrist, the experimental injection, does not require an additional technology to make it the mark of the Antichrist. It does not require an additional something such as a type of behavior, such as worshiping a statue or worshiping the Antichrist or something in order to make it the mark of the Antichrist. It is the mark of the Antichrist in its current form, and this is the reason for this prediction. And believe me, I know better than you do why and how I have come to this prediction. It is to prove what I have just said. This 10 days of testing is the symbolic reason for the 10 days injunction on horn blowing outside Parliament as a result of the class action lawsuit from the 21-year-old girl. This is the end of part 1 of the Trucker Freedom Convoy protest prophetic sign video. Trust me, I am just getting started. The second half of this video, which is part 2 of this video, will be exponentially more interesting. And also part 2 is a very important video. Among many amazing things, I will explain how the trucker protest, the Emergencies Act, and especially the extremely destructive derecho windstorm that slammed Canada's capital, Ottawa, on May 21st, is revealing that the coming catastrophic solar storm coronal mass ejection hit from the sun. If you found this part 1 video to be at all interesting, make sure you watch part 2. I will leave in the description box below this video a link to part 2. See you in the truly amazing part 2 of this video. This video is dedicated to the truckers and all of those involved in standing up for our God-given freedoms. In the meantime, I will leave you with this video of the scene of the protest at the border in Alberta. This has to be the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I tear up watching it. If you have the eyes to see it, the glare from the setting sun symbolizes the kingdom of heaven. The righteous brothers and sisters standing shoulder to shoulder in their last stand against the increasing powers of darkness are on their way to paradise. Someone is holding a sign that says, "So many lies. There will be no more lies where they are going."
We're standing on guard.
Lean on me.
We're standing on guard.
When you're
We're
not
standing on guard.
This is emotional, guys.
I love every single one of you. God will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This week we will lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
That's right, guys. Good job. Good job. Proud of you. This is amazing.
I will die for your children. I've never done this kind of thing before. None of us have.
Keep sharing, you guys. Please, please keep sharing. This is a peaceful stand.